Okay, I think it's a time that we continue with today's panel. I hope for those who have been with us from the morning that you had a nice break with some refreshing coffee or tea included. And we wish you a welcome back to the second panel for a name for today for the conference Feminist for this year Feminist Peace Conference. For those who have just joined us, we also wish you a warm welcome, and we are very happy to have you with us. I'm Bojana Mumin, working in Sarajevo office in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I will be your host for today. So before we officially start with the last panel for today, let me just remind you, those who have been with us from the morning, and also introduce for the one who have just joined us, some logistical information regarding this panel. We have secured translations in following languages: Albanian, Bahais, Macedonian, and English. And you can find the interpretation in the little globe on the bottom of your screen. Just press it, and then you will find the language that suits your needs. I hope that is clear, but also feel free, in case you experience any difficulties regarding the translation, please write to our tech support in the chat option. So once again, welcome to a last panel with the name Alternative Narratives, Feminist Peace. The aim of this panel actually is to look more closely on the concept of feminist peace and in what way it's presents. Panel will bring discussions on what are the feminist alternatives to the social divisions and the tensions that are happening all over the world, including the war narratives. Our guests today and speakers are the peace activists and the researchers with the first-hand knowledge on what feminist work, peace could work in different stages of the conflict. And I'm pretty much sure that the solidarity and the women building movement will be also mentioned as alternative options, since it was also mentioned in the panels that we had this morning. So not to take more time, I will actually stop here and invite our Kvinna Secretary General, Petra Toterman-Andorf, to actually take the floor, since she will moderate today's panel, and she will introduce you more closely with our guests and speakers of today. So Petra, back to you.
Thank you very much, Bojana, and thank you everyone for joining us once again after this short break. As I said this morning, this conference is an opportunity to hear and learn about feminist peace, the power of feminist peace builders and their potential, but also their needs in today's complex political and conflict-ridden world. This morning I said Western Balkan landscape, but I think that goes for a lot of regions in the world right now, unfortunately. This work has been at the heart of the Kvinna to Kvinna Foundation since we were founded in the mid-1990s. And I think that most of you are well aware that we did start our work in the Western Balkans during the wars during the 90s. And now we work in 4 different regions in 20 countries with over 150 women's rights organizations who every day fight the fight for feminist peace, for women's rights, for gender equal societies, etc., etc. The list can go on. In this very panel, we will talk about alternative narratives. We will talk about feminist peace and what that means. And whenever it comes to feminism, it is both structural and individual at the same time. You know, we all have our own history, our own path that we walked upon, our own analysis about what is feminism for me, what is feminist in society. And I think that is what also makes these conversations so exciting, because we all come from different backgrounds and different roles and experiences. But very important, we all have one mouth and 2 ears. And I think that's the ratio, you know, always try to listen more than you talk. And in this conversation, we have, however, invited 4 very eminent persons who will talk a lot and the rest of us will listen. There is an opportunity to write comments or questions in the chat, and towards the end of this session, if time permits, then I will include your questions and reflections to the panelists to reflect on again. So I will ask the panelists to introduce themselves when they get their first questions, but just so you know who are in the room, we have Katarina Karakatanis, who is a peace builder advisor at Kvinna, and we have Diana Francis, who is joining us from the UK. We have Oksana Potapova, who is also working with Kvinna, and so is Leila Gachanica, who is joining us today. So I will turn first to Katarina. Let's see, yes, I see you there. Excellent, I see all of you, lovely. So Kvinna has produced this report that I mentioned this morning when I introduced the conference, A Right Not a Gift, which is based on the input of women human rights defenders and activists from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Iraq, Syria, South Caucasus, and Ukraine. Could you tell us a little bit about the learnings that we got from that report?
Thanks, Petra, and good afternoon to everyone listening today. My name is Katarina Karakatanis, and I work at Kvinna in Stockholm as the peace building advisor, which means that I try to connect the various work on peace building that we do in the 20 countries that we work in. So as Petra mentioned, Kvinna published a report, A Right Not a Gift, in 2020. And the purpose of the report was to try to look back at 20 years of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which for those not familiar, is a policy framework that acknowledged the gendered aspects of war, violent conflict, and its aftermath. It highlighted the disproportionate and unique ways that women and girls are impacted by armed conflict, and it noted the important role that women play in conflict prevention, in conflict resolution, and in peace building. So the report, A Right Not a Gift, is based on us listening to 91 women in 6 conflict contexts: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. So we'll hear some more reflections from Bosnia and Herzegovina and from Ukraine later on in this panel. So before I even begin, I think that many of you can guess that the women interviewed highlighted that there are still many remaining obstacles to the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But the report also aimed to do more than just reflect on the past achievements and failures of working on gendered issues of peace and security. It also asks us, what can we do right now as peace builders, as feminists, as activists to change the system? And what future do women human rights defenders want? So we spend a lot of time at Kvinna talking about the word peace. And I'm sure that many of you here today have written your own definition on a Post-it note, likely multiple times at some workshop or conference. And I'm pretty sure we could fill a football stadium with the amount of Post-it notes we've created over the years of our own personal definitions of peace. And the report raised some of the most common areas that we do hear needs to be included for real peace. It needs to be sustained at multiple levels. It needs to include economic rights and power, include access to housing, land, property, security, justice, and gender equality. And the women interviewed highlighted how war and violent conflict goes far beyond the battlefield. It impacts the way citizens can walk around their own city, and the hardened violence creeps into other spaces, like the home. And it shows up in language, in memory, and in visions of the future. We also heard how peace is understood differently, depending on the stability, the safety, and the violence experienced by women in their everyday lives. So for example, a Ukrainian participant commented that the minimum requirement for peace is physical security. Otherwise, you're preoccupied with survival and not about building peace. Yet we had other participants, especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the militarization of society is not experienced currently in the same way, who said that they consider where there's peace, there is security. So in other words, security is the outcome of peace. One of the main arguments of the report is that there must be an investment in the excluded majority. So that's the women, LGBTQIA+, and youth. and this who must be at the center of building and sustaining peace processes. Because the current system focused on the elites and the military winners of war, holding the political power, is not working and never really has worked. We can't fix injustices and hatred through consolidating power in the hands of these actors and then expect for the root causes of the issues to go away without any clear roadmap of how or when that will happen. And I personally really like this term excluded majority, as it reminds us that we have the power. We are the people who can make the changes that we want to see. It also really points to why it's so important to continuously have discussions about intersectionality, about racism, and decolonization while working on peace building. As many of us know, based on our gender identity, what it's like to be excluded, and our work must explicitly work to include others who, based on their characteristics or identity, are excluded, but also the structural issues that have led to certain groups and individuals to be excluded. So one thing pointed out in the report, and that we've heard across various contexts, is that the power that our language has to exclude and alienate. So for example, the word peace can imply giving up territory, or it can be seen as a normalization of violence, unequal power structures, and even the erasure of a group of people, and therefore leads to people positioning themselves against it before engaging what it means to them. Being aware of the power dynamics in the context and between those asking and answering is essential to get to the underlying needs and priorities for people. And sometimes the conflict narrative allows inequalities and discrimination to become hidden under explanations like ancient hatreds. Maybe now is a good time also to mention that my personal interest in peace building comes from my own experience growing up in a city called Derry, located in Northern Ireland. So I just, in my explanation of where I'm from, excluded and included different viewpoints. As some would say Londonderry instead of Derry, and others name it the north of Ireland instead of Northern Ireland. But the report reminds us that as the excluded majority, we need to focus on the root causes of the tensions. We need to include more people, different people, to work together to find ways to go forward. And this includes a lot more work that needs to happen to break down the many barriers that women human rights defenders face, from patriarchal systems and gender discrimination, to security, to gender-based violence. So in summary, there needs to be a shift from exclusion to inclusion. And this isn't just a set of recommendations that we can tick off. We need to change the system, the structures, and so many societal norms that will help include more voices in political power. And I really think this report is so rich because it highlights so many of the interlinking and connected areas for peace and security. Can you have peace without working on education, on economic rights and power, or on resolving injustices and providing accountability? We have so much work to do, which seems like a big challenge, but it also means that we can push forward for change in different ways, in various contexts, and with the tools and power that each of us have. And together, we can push for a lasting peace, one that addresses the root causes of structural violence and power inequalities, while simultaneously working towards gender equality.
Thank you, Katarina. May I just, and this is, now I'm asking you an impossible question. Could you really brief tell us what the concept of feminist peace brings to the conversations?
Yes, it's a big question, but I think one of the strengths of us using a feminist lens on our approach to peace building is how we're able to examine the links of militarization, of capitalism, of patriarchy, and how this impacts peace. And our understanding of peace, we know, and of feminism is not just a one-size-fits-all theory. So some participants we interviewed in the report from Bosnia and Herzegovina noted that they began looking into a feminist understanding of peace after witnessing the impact of war on their society, while others we spoke to, including in Ukraine, noted that they approach the conflict from a feminist perspective, and that they see the tentacles of patriarchy, of nationalism, and militarism in initiating and prolonging and profiting from the conflict. And also the report is really good at noting the links between anti-gender movement and nationalism and militarism, which I think is also a really important part of our understanding of feminist peace. So those who criticize gender roles are often seen as ruining the traditional roles of men and women and family. And they're also considered to be implicitly attacking the nation state and the structures and the institutions that are required to uphold the greatness of the motherland or the fatherland. And this often means you can't criticize the actors in the institutions who belong to the same side as you. So this silences dissent and difference of opinion. And it also is a dangerous situation for women human rights defenders who do go against the established narrative. And I think, it's also really important to note that many of the women that we interviewed from the report, and we've seen this in other contexts as well, would not name themselves as peace builders. And this could be either because of connotations associated with the name, or maybe because of safety issues.
Yeah.
But I think that these anti-gender and these nationalist forces are really a threat to all of us, reinforcing the need for joint solidarity and partnership and movement building. So I think this kind of brings us back to then what is our feminist peace? And how do we build a movement for peace across borders and across context? So just as we're arguing for a more complex understanding of the structural issues underpinning gender inequality, we also see that there's complications in defining and understanding peace and how to build it in each of our contexts. And we can learn and we can question in difficult times to ask ourselves and one another, what is peace? What is it we even want? Is it peace? Is it something else? And we'll hear a little bit more about the tensions of the theory of feminist peace and how it works in practice a little bit later on, I think from other panelists, and how there's not really a clear answer to these questions.
No.
But it's really important, that we together kind of discuss and learn, I guess, in these spaces to then define what it means for us. And I think one of the things that the report highlights, and I think a lot of the approach that Kvinna takes on feminist peace, is that our solidarity with one another and our movement together might just be the solution. So together we are the alternative identities, and we provide an alternative way of looking at the past and the present and in building the future. And I think for me, this is really our greatest power we have together.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we will continue talking about that. And I think it is really interesting and important, just the same as, the feminist foreign policy, when that was launched a few years ago. We in civil society, women's rights movement, had one opinion what it was. And the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they set their agenda to what a feminist foreign policy. And now about 10 countries in the world has it. And I think everyone has a little different twist. So we will definitely get back to that. Thank you, Katarina, for bringing us up to date a little bit on the report, and it's been shared a link to it in the chat as well. So then I would like to turn to you, Diana. You have many years of experience from activism and academia and from many different conflict settings. You've written about large-scale expressions of people power where autocrats have been overthrown, but that has not necessarily translated into more peace. So please introduce yourself, give us a little short introduction to who you are and why you wanted to contribute to this conversation. And then also let us know what is missing in these contexts as you learned about for more peace. And should we even be talking about peace, or is it justice, or is it something else that we need? What do we need, Diana? Tell us. Diana, you're muted.
Sorry.
No problem. I told you were muted while I was muted, so we're in together.
Sorry. Sometimes on these things, somebody else does all that and you just appear. But anyway, yes, I'm a technophobe. So which is a real stereotype for a woman. Sorry about that. I am, as you described me, really a mix of things, and I've worked as a volunteer, as a local activist, as an international professional, but always with movements and with grassroots people on the whole, and occasionally with military themselves, who have been all male. And actually, I found that quite a tender thing, seeing how helpless and out of themselves they were when they'd been beaten. So yeah, and they have their own dilemmas, so I can have some empathy, but I like especially working with women. So I was asked to speak a bit about the, non-violent overthrow of regimes, and is it very successful? Is it, as somebody said, a mixed success? I think it varies, and we have the good evidence gathered by Chenoweth and Stefan to give us the statistics on the relative successes. But I think the durability and the fluid solidity of what results is not usually what we'd hoped for. And I think way back to my first real excitement about nonviolent people power in the overthrow of President Marcos, because I had strong connections with the Philippines at the time, and that was so wonderful to see this thing happen. And then I've vaguely traced the progress of the Philippine peoples since then, and it hasn't been the lovely peace, in inverted commas, that we'd have hoped for, and it hasn't been as durable, and now we see another Marcos in position. So my fear is that so often the revolution goes round and goes back to where it was, and I think the Arab Spring has been a very salutary expression of that, with you will time me, won't you? Give me a 2-minute warning, because I get lost. Yes, so in Egypt, for instance, where I did work a bit briefly in the interlude of hope after the uprising, and already things were beginning to split in the movement. It was dividing again into old camps that had come together to remove the dictator. And of course, then they ended up back with another dictator. And so it just reinforced what I should always have realized, that peace isn't built in an event. And you say, what is peace? I think peace is security for everyone in all those aspects that Katerina was talking about. That's, to me, as good a definition of peace as I've got to. And it's also, and we're forgetting this all the time, but some of us not, of course, is the security of the planet itself. So where do I think we have to look? I think we have to look at transformative models in which many, many strands of society are involved. It's not a one-off about just taking away the person at the top of the structures, but about changing the structures themselves. It's about disruption sometimes. It's not that non-violent disruptive action won't and resistance won't be needed, but it also needs non-violent constructive action and endless dialogue. So this isn't a contest between these and those, but it's a cooperative building of something different, working from the bottom up. So, and that means that it's power with each other, not power over each other. And that to me is so, so important. We think about a contest of who's going to be in charge, but that's being in charge, that's about domination. And of course, militarism's all about a kind of raw and extreme version of domination. Violence is what it is, domination and taking away the security of others. So it's a bottom-up process. And of course, you can have moments of triumph, if you like, but it should be celebrating with as many people as possible when you have a triumph, not a yee-hi, we got the best of that lot. That's not where we need to go.
Diana, what are some of the trends and challenges that you have seen over the years?
Yeah.
And do you think that there are the current times that are different from the previous, in your view? I mean, you worked on these topics for a long time, and I mean, the peace movement it's not as old as war is, but peace movement's been around for about 100+ years at least.
So you want to know what I'm coming on to what's different.
Yes.
Is that where you're trying to edge me?
Yes. That's where I'm trying to hear you. Exactly. What do you see right now?
Yeah, that's fine. So I think the other thing that I've really noticed is that local activists can achieve great things, and I'm hugely in support of local activism to bring about healing after conflict, to rebuilding and everything. But their efforts can be going on for years and gradually making progress, and then geopolitics comes in and smashes it all aside. I worked in the South Caucasus for many years, and I saw that happen heartbreakingly, when people had really managed to achieve some sort of stability, the beginnings of healing. And then you get the two big powers as were, this is all changing, but the United States and Russia coming into conflict with each other. And yeah, it's an underground contest going on, and it's so disruptive of peace. So now I'm thinking we have to think bigger. We have to think also about the grassroots, local, slow processes, and sometimes great excitements of change. But we also have to think about a change in international structures, the geopolitics and the international structures. And this is a huge task. The military-industrial complex. We can all say it, it's been said for decades, but how do we disrupt that? How do we change it? How do we change the way people think so that they don't accept that anymore? They see what it's doing to people and planet. We have to, and this is my symbolic thing, remove the statues of men on horses in all our European cities. Just take them away, hide them away, and replace them. Because it's toxic masculinity that underlines all this, all of it. It's about power as big boy power. And if I see what's going on in Europe now, that's where it is. And it's utterly tragic, and it destroys lives and homes, and it's endless. So we need a big international movement that's moving for a different sort of power and for the replacement of the current structures in the world. And it's too big even to contemplate, but if we don't, within a few decades, life as we know it could be over, whether it's through a nuclear holocaust or through climate change. And the climate change is being driven as we speak by the latest big conflict. So somehow we have to take our vision to big as well as to small. And those have to go together and support each other. And we have to use the power of compassion and solidarity and humility and the power to nurture each other into a different way of being. And I'd like to stop, which is presumably what I need to do, by quoting Adrienne Rich, because she speaks for me all the time. My heart is moved by all I cannot say. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And that's what we need to do. And we don't have ages, but we have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. You will come back later as well, but thank you for bringing up the balance. I mean, Katarina we talked to local grassroots and women peace builders, and you brought in the international perspective and how we have to work on the different levels at the same time. Thank you very much. I now would like to turn to you, Oksana. And we are aware that you, being Ukrainian, and from you talking about peace right now and talking about conflict and war and militarization is very close to home. It's very close to you, since an active war is raging in your country as we speak. So thank you for contributing with your thoughts and your experience, of course, and knowledge at this moment. And I know that there has been discussions within the Ukrainian feminist movement about how the reality of war has affected some deeply held positions on peace and conflict resolution. So if you please could share some of the insights into what kind of dilemmas that Ukrainian feminists are faced with right now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Petra, for your questions, and thank you again for inviting me to this panel. You know, a few months ago, I contributed to writing a report on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and I discovered that there is such a notion as, you know, the analysis of coping mechanisms of populations in conflict. And I think for me, thinking together is one of the coping mechanisms. So I'm very, very glad to be able to be doing this together with other feminist minds, including at this panel. And I have thoughts coming to my mind right now as we speak that I hope to share later as well. Speaking of the feminist movement in Ukraine, I am indeed sharing as both someone who has been part of grassroots activism for peace and women's rights in Ukraine since 2014, when the conflict in Donbass erupted, causing almost 2 million people being displaced and 69% of them at least being women, and causing as well deaths and affecting the socio-economic situation in Ukraine. And I just want to give a little overview of what the diverse groups among feminist and women's rights organizations have been doing since 2014, because I think we cannot speak about the current situation without that retrospect. And when I was looking back, I realized that once again, we cannot speak about a single homogenized feminist movement as such. As Katarina wisely mentioned in the beginning, it's always a plurality of approaches and perspectives. And women's rights and feminist organizations since 2014 have been involved in diverse ways of responding to the conflict. Both highlighting the experience of women who voluntarily joined the military forces and have been invisible and marginalized, and also in some cases abused inside the system, and bringing attention to the importance of recognizing women's role in security and defense forces. There have been women's groups that were working with displaced communities and with the gendered aspects of displacement, myself included, and advocating for a more holistic approach to security, which includes human security, again, previously mentioned already, And again, drawing the attention to the balance between the need for our country to defend our borders and also to integrate socioeconomic aspects of security, mental health, and gender equality as well. And with all these different, there was also a really strong dialogue and mediation community in place, which consists predominantly of women, although doesn't always articulate itself as a women's movement, interestingly enough. And what I realized is that regardless of how successful these different groups were in achieving their goals, and I myself struggled at times to convey the message of the importance of human security at the same time as the country is in conflict, and to kind of shape together this notion of holistic feminist security and peace. I realize now that all of these different types of activism were driven by genuine demand from below. And I think it's important for me to stress that whatever has been going on and continues to go on in Ukraine right now has a really strong bottom-up spirit to it, with women, feminists, women of different ages, of different groups and intersectional identities, seeing themselves as agentic, seeing themselves as the ones who are not only impacted, but also want to have a say on the security, on the policies, and in current response as well. And so I think this plurality is what also informs the last 8 years and also the current response and conversations. Of course, what has changed in February this year is that I think all of us, including Ukraine, but the rest of the world, have seen an escalation of a war that nobody has expected, where clearly the state, one state invaded the territory of another state. There isn't really a situation where we can speak about an intra-state conflict, meaning, two sides are, starting a war against each other. There is a very clear perpetrator in this situation, again, speaking of the larger geopolitical level. And this is where many of us who have been part of anti-militarist feminist movement have had to sit down and rethink for ourselves what it means for us to continue to be peace activists at the same time as we hold on to women's rights and human rights at large, which for us are inseparable. And this led to many women's organizations, first of all, doing more of and even better of what they know already, which is reaching out to women in their communities and providing services to women who are affected in different ways. Because again, gendered response or the understanding of gendered needs is often missing from state policies or even from the work of the international organizations. And the women's civil society is leading that response. But we have also been sitting with the understanding that the news that are coming out of the territories that are occupied by the Russian forces and then liberated are rampant with human rights abuses, violations, massive atrocities and war crimes. And in a way, stopping this war where it is and allowing the aggressor, in this case Russia, to remain in those territories would mean even more human rights violations, lack of any political space for participation, as we know that political activists are being targeted, persecuted, and kidnapped continuously. And so this challenge between wanting democracy and wanting peace and security, of course, and at the same time recognizing that it comes with justice and it comes with the ability to instill democratic rule in the territory in order to ensure lasting peace, not just a momentarily ceasefire, is a dilemma that many feminists are resolving by inviting the world to recognize that armed resistance is one of the ways of an agentic response to an invasion like that. And this is where I would say that some voices exist as well that see that such a response can lead to more lives being lost on both sides. And of course, recognize that as well. And I think we all hold the importance of human lives. We just keep discussing with each other, you know, what are the costs of saving these lives and what are the preconditions for that. And I think the important notion here that I will probably mention before I take a pause as well is Katarina. Sorry, I think I disconnected briefly. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we hear you again. You were just
I'm
about
sorry.
Yeah.
I'm saying that what I found quite interesting is that even though in the previous 8 years of feminist movement responding to conflict, many of us were on the ground doing the action and being involved in advocacy, but a lot of the thinking and conceptualizing about us was still done by somebody else, mainly by external researchers or peace building specialists or feminist experts from outside. Again, a common dilemma, I think, which we see in many contexts. And ever since the beginning of the invasion in February, I have seen a tremendous rise of feminist voices that are ready to think, to articulate, and to conceptualize our own reality to other feminists and together with other feminists. We've had tremendous panels, including one chaired by Judith Butler, where we spoke about feminist solidarity with Ukrainian academic and activist community. And these feminist voices from Ukraine are bringing a queer perspective on what this conflict means, a decolonial perspective on what the roots of this war are and what the solutions can be. They are calling for an anti-capitalist analysis of this war, looking at larger economic ties between Europe and Russia. They are looking at militarization from a more global perspective, not only militarization of Ukraine, but militarization trends, trading weapons between Europe and Russia and between other kind of large empires, and connecting militarism to imperialism as an important understanding of the analysis of this war. And I think for me personally, as someone who also is a scholar, this is potentially such an important shift towards having, again, a different kind of conversation where voices who are embedded in the context and yes, are embodying this war at the same time are ready and willing to articulate. We don't have to wait until our trauma is settled or, the war is over and then we'll start thinking together. And the request to the global community of feminists, first and foremost, is to exactly do what you were mentioning in the beginning, is to create spaces where our voices can be heard, kind of first person, and our position can be understood, and we can think together, holding this idea of, yes, we still want peace for Ukraine and for the rest of the world that is struggling with consequences of this war. But we don't want our voices and needs to be silenced in the design of that peace. And to me, that is a very hopeful avenue, to be honest. And I think I'll stop here and hopefully contribute some more thoughts a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana, for sharing. That's extremely important and relevant what you're saying about you being so present in this now and the conversations that you're having. It feels really a privilege for us to be part of that and be able to support that and take part in the journey, the very hard journey that you and your colleagues are in. But then I would like to turn to you, Leila, and it would be great if you could, describe Bosnia-Herzegovina today in terms of war and peace. And you are, as a different from Oksana, you're a few decades after the actual war stopped. But what are some of the challenges that you still see today when it comes in terms of peace and justice and peace versus justice in Bosnia-Herzegovina? And what are the discussions that you are having today in the feminist movement in Bosnia-Herzegovina regarding these issues? And how is it taking place? And please just a little brief introduce yourself as well.
Well, thank you. My name is Leila Gačanica. I'm a program officer at Kvinna office in Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I've also been engaged as a peace activist and researcher in the area of transitional justice with a focus on dealing with the past, politics of memory, anti-discrimination standards. I would also like to emphasize that I had the privilege to work over 15 years with youth and CSOs in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Western Balkan region on the issues of reconciliation, dialogue, and human rights, in particular from gender perspective. Having that said, and having this...
Leila, before you continue, and this is for all of us, we need to talk a little bit slower for the translators. And now when you got started, I was reminded. So there will be times to say everything, but we all need to remind ourselves to talk a little slower. Sorry to interrupt.
Sure. This is something that I'm continuously struggling with. So thank you for the reminder. So when we talk about war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it is really important to see that we do have this time lapse so we can observe what works and what does not work in this context. War in Bosnia and Herzegovina from the 1990s ended by signing international peace agreements, so-called Dayton Peace Agreement, which stopped armed conflict and opened a new chapter called post-conflict society. No women was among the negotiators, mediators, or signatories of the peace agreement, and this is something that we really need to emphasize on the very beginning. The Dayton Agreement at the same time affirmed ethnic power sharing among ethnic groups, and basically in reality, the peace element of this agreement mainly ran out precisely by stopping the killing and destruction, but at the same time, violation of human rights, discrimination, the establishment of frozen conflict has continued to this day. Now, in thinking about our society, which I would rather describe as an absence of the war rather than a positive peace, we use 27 years of time distance and can share the experience of a really difficult post-conflict journey. From the position of official policies of a deeply ethnically divided state, our experience would be, I'm afraid, how not to build peace. This result of official policies and the absence of a systematic approach to peace and justice has actually resulted in at least 3 contested ethnic exclusive narratives about war, the interpretation of war, in which ethnicity is a dominant and at the same time uncompromising identity element. Having that said, it is really visible that there is no place for women, there is no place for others, there is no place for different or civic identity or something that we would like to see or address in our post-conflict and our peace-building processes. And this is where the feminist approach in Bosnia and Herzegovina to justice was formed as a basically necessary counter-narrative rooted in the need for the overcoming imposed ethnical borders for peace, reconciliation, but also identity. Aware that the exclusion of women from peace processes leads to women's rights, the role of women in war and peace, and of course, sexualized violence being underestimated by, and often, of course, neglected by government in Bosnia and Herzegovina, women were those who first crossed ethnic lines just after the war and during the war as well, and both symbolically and physically. Reparation processes, for example, when we talk about transitional justice, have been initiated and led by women organizations. Then fight against sexual violence, stigmatization, not related exclusively to women, but also to men in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war came from women, both survivors and activists. And not only that, and I'm not talking now only about so-called women's questions and women issues, but many human rights issues have been raised exactly by women and women's civil society organizations. And what we have to remind ourselves from time to time and to be aware that these processes have not been easy. And being outside of ethnic and so-called official narratives basically makes them alternative even today. So we can see that during these 27 years, there have not been improvement in terms to become a mainstream, to become a part of official politics. And I completely agree that the peace building and the feminist peace must to take a bottom-up approach, but at the same time, you would expect that in certain time lapse, we can actually expect more responsible and more respectful relationship from the institutions and from that level. And I would like to refer to something that Lana Bobic shared in a previous panel when she said that how movement and how feminists have been labeled as an anti-family. In these constellations, we are labeled as basically anti-state and anti-nation actors. So it's not only that it has been difficult to be outside of the official narrative, but it's also been difficult to defend feminist principles as something that overcomes borders that have been established by the war and by the agreements. So when we have to define what in Bosnia and Herzegovina today means fighting for peace and having feminist peace, I would say it means fight for the dialogue about the war, the questioning interpretations, one single or one ethnic interpretations of the war, fight for the rights of the survivors and victims and transitional justice mechanisms, but also fight for the equality and constantly swimming against nationalistic current. At the same time, or while democratic values in Bosnia and Herzegovina exist mainly as an abstract principles.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leila. Okay, so I would like to take a second round of questions to you in the panel before we go to the questions from the chat. So if I turn to you, Diana, we very often work in silos, not understanding the interconnections between the environment, peace and democracy, etc. So what are some of the opportunities or good practices from contexts not represented in this panel that you could share with us? Sorry, you have to unmute yourself. I can't do that, or maybe I can, but.
Do it, that's all right. It's just I always forget. I think that the best example that I can come up with in a very short time is in the USA, the American Friends Service Committee did a study of what their government's foreign policy could look like. And it was really amazing. It was groundbreaking. It was highly consultative. And of course, it was very different from the foreign policy that exists. And that inspired us in the UK. So I'm sorry to talk about a UK case, but this is the one I can speak about with the most authority. Is we set up an organization which is called Rethinking Security. And it came from a base of people who were working in peace building in different parts of the world. And they thought that this would be the best framework for trying to change things in our own country. We see the UK as a nuisance in the world, an influence for bad, and we're very much aware of our colonial past and so on. And we want to we see it actually as not working in favor of the security of local people, So we started this network of all sorts of organizations who have affiliated to it, to rethink the meaning of security. So it's not a military thing. It's not something that you get with armies. Armies come in, as I fully understand, if you've been invaded. But what is it that's behind all that? The real security would be not having those things happen. So what is human security? What is planetary security? And we're gaining quite a bit of traction locally just by this involvement of so many organizations. And there are several similar setups being created in different parts of Europe. And you can go to the website, which is, as you'd expect, rethinkingsecurity.org.uk, and find out more about it. It's a dream, but it's actually creating really across the board debate about what is human security, what does it involve, and how can those different movements for human rights or climate protection or whatever, how can we come together and build a different concept of what security means, which I think would be an important shift.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And I would also like to take this opportunity to remind all of you who are listening to write questions in the chat or comments that you would like us to bring up, reflections to bring to the panel. So while you do that, I'm sure that there are many of you who have answers to the questions I pose or questions to the panel. I would like to turn to you, Oksana, and see, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the ways in which women and women's organizations are contributing to conflict resolution, if that's even a term to be used at this point today? And how can feminists and allies outside of Ukraine support a resolution to the current war?
I've unmuted myself. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I also keep looking for the terms that can describe the work that is, of course, being done on the ground, and sometimes concepts are secondary to what's actually happening and the beauty of it and the value of it. So, as I mentioned before, as in every crisis, first of all, women's and feminist organizations are responding to multiple security needs of the affected communities, transforming their work from being, human rights and advocacy organizations to basically humanitarian response, creating shelters, delivering sanitary kits or necessary medication and contraception, while at the same time making connections between, sexual and reproductive rights in war and in peace times, and wishing for a more gender-sensitive world for women even after the war is over. At the same time, women mediators and dialogue facilitators are also working on the ground with different communities where tensions arise, as they eventually do because of lack of resources, because of trauma. And I know of at least one initiative that has been operational since the very first month of this invasion, where teams of mediators and mental health professionals are attending communities with high numbers of displaced people and monitoring the potentials of local conflict and offering their support to manage, mediate, or transform those conflicts, making sure ultimately that the different needs of communities are met, and that the way people communicate with each other about those needs, is constructive. And I want to refer to a statement that my colleagues, community of dialogue mediators and facilitators from Ukraine have made and published at the beginning of May, where they actually analyze the types of peace-building work that they see helpful and constructive in Ukraine right now, with the main focus being on this kind of community mediation and community resilience work that they see necessary and important, and also raising, concerns or warning against these a little bit maybe cookie cut responses, actually advocating against the current direct dialogue between Russian and Ukrainian sides due to the high level of trauma and the ongoing violence. And a third thing that they're stressing, which I also, speaking of what can be done and can be supported, I want to stress is that many peace, security, and women's rights organizations and activists are becoming, the transnational dimension of this conflict is becoming evident to us, and the importance of existing and future networks in the region, both in the region of Eastern Europe, where networks of women's organizations are already creating myriads of ways to help women access reproductive health needs for women, for example, who leave Ukraine and come to Poland and have limitations there for the reasons that we are all aware of. So the women's rights organizations call for support of transnational networks, both inside the EU and as well, and especially in the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. I can refer here to a brilliant report that recently came out by an organization called Voice Amplified, which did a scoping of not only Ukraine, but the region as well, Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, and a few neighboring countries that have been impacted by displacement, talking about exactly this, how women's movements have been underfunded in the region, where gender equality has already been on the verge of threatened in these regions. So bringing back the attention to the region, and finally bringing back the attention to the global dimension of this war. And this is something that I am becoming more aware of as I'm currently living in Germany, and I'm speaking to colleagues in different countries, working in foreign service and international organizations, and listening to how this is already impacting their realities, the gas prices, the economy, the changes of budgets in their countries. And I think the illusion that the war somewhere else will not affect us is no longer there. And I see more than ever that we need to sit down together as feminists, and we need to look at how this is impacting us and where the responsibility for advocacy lies. And perhaps instead of, as sometimes I still hear, calling just Russians and Ukrainians to sit down and talk, which I know for some people seems like an easy solution to the ending of the war. Perhaps more responsibility can be placed on feminists in the West, who can advocate for their governments to impose embargoes on Russia, or to cancel foreign debt of Ukraine, to have this global lobbying, not only on behalf of Ukraine, but also on behalf of transformations of security and economic systems that have made this war possible. So maybe I'm dreaming big, but I think the feminist response to this war really lies in strengthening ties of solidarity across the regions that were not even so obvious to us, and breaking this divide of the global north and global south even more, as we continually try to do.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Thank you for that. Leila, in your experience, what are some of the things that are lacking or neglected for sustainable feminist peace? And perhaps I think it was a really interesting place where you left us off, Oksana, of, what can we as feminists, international feminists, whatever we are all national and international, but the spaces we work in, what we can do and what not, but also what you see, of course, in Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Sure, there are many things that have been basically mentioned during Katerina's presentation of our report, but what I would really like to emphasize is that, of course, all the approaches and methods to be used in the future should be transformative, as Diana said. But now I'm afraid that we are still facing some of the, let's say, basic obstacles to feminist peace and to inclusion of women in all these processes, but also not including them, but also creating alternative, not narratives, but also spaces for the work. In certain time, I believe this should not be on the margins, on the alternative side of the history and of the collaborations. But I would really like to start with few very obvious problems that we are still facing, such as women are still mainly excluded from decision making. They have been excluded from peace negotiations even today. They have been excluded from the reforms, and we can see that in Bosnia and Herzegovina very clearly, especially when it comes, for example, to constitutional reform, which is part of the Dayton Peace Agreement. Now you can basically see how this prolonged effect of being alternative and staying alternative reflects on our everyday life and peace that we are trying to build here. But not only in Bosnia and Herzegovina, despite it is necessary to have alternative voices, I believe long-term alternative position may never be translated in official politics nor collective memory. And this is something that we really have to question and something that we had to be prepared and not being tired to work on these issues in the future as well. So changing the failed status quo requires that women and women-led civil society have the opportunity to actively contribute to peace processes. Also, gender inequalities are still neglected and have not been prioritized. And we can see from different experiences that it has been on the margin and usually stayed there. The problem lies not just in the numbers of women like being or not being present, but also in a women's influence on political decisions. Women first have to struggle for the inclusion, then for the recognition, and finally for political power to bring real change. And I think this is a three-step process that we are still going through. And also, I would like to emphasize that there is no quick or easy solution to the divisions and conflicts, not only in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but existing conflicts now. But yet, I believe that the social and the state processes must not be parallel, but united. And I would also like to reflect on certain issues that arose from previous discussions, and that is basically how we treat all these people that we are trying to reach, our societies. And I would say that the issue of peace and justice is something that we are still trying to achieve, but at the same time, it is something that very much involve victims, but not also victims, but also post-war generations. And sometimes we forget that we have basically completely new generations who have been born and raised and grown up in divisions and hatred. So the impact of the conflict is gendered, but it's not happening only during the conflict, but in all these post-conflict times. So, for example, if we try to compare is peace and is justice the same on the same side of the coin, then we definitely have to see how that works or does not work. And I can share experience from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And when I mentioned this time lapse of 27 years, I have to mention at the same time that we have a really specific denial of the justice that impacts on victims, and unfortunately many will not live long enough to see the justice. So you can see, like, these are processes, but we have to bear in mind what kind of consequences of long and wasted time and wasting time on different processes and exclusion may basically bring. For example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it is estimated that approximately 20,000 women and men were raped or sexually abused during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the recent data basically showed that only 1,000 basically have obtained or is in process of obtaining some kind of reparations. So when we talk about peace, we cannot talk without justice. And when we talk about justice, then we have to include everybody, not only survivors, not only victims, not only civil society, and definitely not put burden exclusively on civil society, human rights, and citizens.
Thank you very much, Leila. There's been a question from the audience for you, so I'll post that right away. Do you think that there was a consensus between different women's organizations in Bosnia and Herzegovina on how peace was to be built?
I believe there is, especially if we see what is the root cause of the conflict even today, and that lies along ethnic sides. But at the same time, I believe that many of civil society organizations and women's organizations work on the same side, but definitely on different territories, and trying to capture all the issues and basically challenges that have been imposed not only by legislative framework, which is quite difficult in Bosnia and Herzegovina and quite fragmented, but at the same time, I believe that the principles are equal and the goals are equal. Sometimes meanings and the way of work may differ, and sometimes it may seem like we are doing different things, but at the same time, I'm pretty sure that what is the main goal and what is the purpose of the work on war crimes, transitional justice, reparations, memorialization is basically to overcome this ethnic barrier and this imposed narrative about the war, and basically to keep open the spaces which are now quite closed when it comes to official interpretation of the war and the consequences and the role not only of women but any civic identity in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you very much, Leila. There's a question for you, Oksana, as well. How different women's organizations in Ukraine see peace-building process? If are they even in a position to think about this process after the armed conflicts are over?
Another easy question to answer.
Yes.
I think the answer lies partly in how we see that peace building, which is the whole conversation that we're having today. The different comments on future, immediate or long-term future that I hear from feminist and women's rights organizations, of course, all envision the end of the war as the main precondition for any work that we are doing, and also war being the root of escalation of gender-based violence, sexual violence, socioeconomic inequalities, and many others. And as my colleagues also mentioned, we all strive towards that aim, doing it differently. Some feminists call for arms to Ukraine. Others call for a recognition of the injustices that Russia is committing. And I think one thing that many of us are uniting around is that bringing justice to the analysis of this war and to the atrocities that are being committed is not only what Ukraine needs, but it's also a way for preventing future conflicts and imperial invasions in the region, which we know may be possible in regions of South Caucasus, where Russia has also destabilized the region, or in Transnistria. So a lot of the advocacy is actually happening on the, as I said, the academic, but also the international level, thinking together of how global institutions of peace and security are failing us right now in holding accountable a state that is a permanent member of some of these institutions, and at the same time is allowed to keep committing the crimes. At the same time, a lot of conversation is going on the importance of socioeconomic security of women and labor rights as fundamental to the rebuilding of Ukrainian society. And feminists leftists, trade unionists are calling the attention to labor rights, to socioeconomic developments in Ukraine, wishing and hoping that the country that we will be recreating once the violence, armed violence stops, will be more inclusive and more catered to the needs, socioeconomic needs of communities, including women, of course, as the prospects of the number of people who will be dependent on social benefits, who will be on the edge of poverty, are immense. So talking about these things already, not after the war is over, is another important pillar for, as I said, feminist and leftist organizations and movements. And finally, I think keeping the track on gender equality as an inseparable component of war times and peace times, which right now is implemented in different ways, bringing the attention to different women's roles, including leadership roles in government, in civil society. It also means partnering with the government on very concrete initiatives. Right now, the government of Ukraine is revising its current national action plan on women, peace and security, and trying to make it more relevant to the needs of women who survived sexual violence, to the displaced women, integrating the socioeconomic and also mental health aspects. And I think, and the civil society participation in these consultations is very strong. So I think as long as we are trying to defend, the land and the democracy that we have, and also trying to preserve all the structures and mechanisms of participation that have been put in place, is a lot of work already. And in my opinion, this is the foundation of the kind of peace that we will be building. And maybe I will conclude by actually sharing the definition of peace that I gave kind of conceptualized as we speak. It may transform in the future, but hearing different colleagues speaking, I put down the following phrase: that peace to me is when power is used to include diverse voices in productive dialogue and in co-creation of the shared present and future. And I think when we think about what the conditions necessary for this kind of dialogue, where the power that either the government or leaders have, and this relates to civil society, this relates to nation states, this relates to global power institutions. How can this power be used to include and co-create rather than to dominate, exclude, marginalize, and destroy? Is no small question, but the one that I like to keep asking myself. Thank you.
That's really a brilliant question, I think, and a good way of putting it. Katarina, what are some of your reflections on the experiences shared today and the concept of feminist peace?
Well, first, I think the definition Oksana just gave was a very good definition of feminist peace. But one thing maybe that I want to connect is the point that was raised by Oksana on the plurality of ways responding to conflict, and then Diana's point about peace not being the result of a single event. And it really made me think about how, so again, in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, the Northern Ireland's Women Coalition is used always as the successful example of women's inclusion in a formal peace process. And the way that they were included was not because they were invited in or anything like that. It's through many years of different kind of things happening. So for example, one of the people that noticed that they could run for election was a political scientist. So just thinking about the amount of work that gets to the point of a woman being a political scientist who's able to understand these really complex political systems to then make the point that, okay, we can be invited. And a lot of the women who then became part of the coalition, they were the, I think it's included the first woman student union leader of the university in Belfast, Queen's. the heads of who created these rape and crisis centers in Derry and in Belfast. So I think, and we talk about this a lot in Kvinna as well, about, you know, what kind of different things have to happen for feminist peace simultaneously. And I think it really shows that, you know, the way that we get to feminist peace, the way that we get to more inclusion, and the way that we can progress is really through lots and lots and lots of different events happening, from education to lots of other things that kind of set the foundation in place, so that when something happens, there's a greater chance of capitalizing on that. And I think also related to that, violence is also not created overnight. So like Oksana said, you know, about advocating to governments about ways that they can change systems that are creating more conflict. I think it's something that we need to do not just when violence is escalated, but it's something that we need to do and we need to reflect on much more, and these systems that kind of go together to create this, because there's so many things. And we talked, I think Diana mentioned the environment. There's so many different factors that are kind of interrelated that we need to connect and to really give the amount of urgency, so that we're not just waiting to the urgency of lives being lost, but that we're kind of trying consistently to prevent this. And I think, I mean, Leila mentioned about women's exclusion in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it is really hard. You know, we can't find like a one size fits all of this is the roadmap of how we can create more feminist peace. But I do think, I mean, to reclaim the power of peace and the future of alternative identities, we need to make these connections of these issues. So like, you know, the environment that Diana mentioned, or imperialism that Oksana mentioned, and how they relate to peace, and then make sure that different voices are heard and that those from the context themselves are at the center of the conversation. I think that's, I mean, what we can do. We just everything that we can do to kind of try to break down all these mountains ahead of us is kind of the way forward. And I think it's a lot easier to kind of do that together, holding each other's hands, or, you know, leaning on one another, or raising someone up, rather than to kind of chip away at different things at different points, kind of as individuals, but together.
Thank you, Katarina. I have one final question for you, Diana, that came from the chat, and then I'm going to ask all of you in the panel to do just, you know, a final reflection before we end. So I'll read this from the chat, Diana, because it's too long. I can't memorize. It says, many years ago, as a relatively young peace activist, I was extremely inspired by Diana's book, People, Peace and Power, and its notion of importance of constituency. Who are our constituency at the moment? And how can we make sure that wider participation is enabled in and around women's and feminist movement? Also, economic dimensions of post-war reconstruction was highly neglected in the post-Yugoslav region. Peace initiatives tended to forget for too long that people here have been traumatized, not only by the direct war violence, but also by post-war situations of losing their jobs, their working places, their economic security, and they've just been called transitional losers. So Diana, who are our constituency at the moment, and how can we ensure the wider participation, which is something that many of you have mentioned?
That's a very big question, because in the end, it's everybody is our constituency, and every species is our constituency, and everything that affects the climate and all the people involved are our constituency. So how do we make that manageable? I mean, I think that's a very, very big question. I think our we will inevitably have things that we like to focus on, things that we feel equipped to focus on, a place where we have some connections. But I think we have to see this as weaving a web, or creating something out of lots of small parts in the end. And I think we have to cover all the territories of economic justice. And I was thinking about, you know, if we're going to have a world network, how are we going to have the global south is almost absent from almost everything. The people at the worst end of everything, the terrible wars that happen in the global south and the east of the world, those are then ignored. And wars can't compete with each other. They're all absolute human calamities. And so somehow between us, we have to make sure, and I think an international network can best do this. And I think we have a network of international networks we need, but somehow to make sure that we are including everybody. It's an impossible task, but we have to try. And then for ourselves, when we're working on a particular specific aspect of a particular conflict or structural or behavioral violence, we need to find the constituency for that. But in the end, we have to have a world that works for everybody, or it's going to work for nobody. And also, how do we value human beings? All of them, even the ones who are destroying. How do we bring everybody in? It's endless. It really is, but it's urgent. And I think we need to go to the deepest place in ourselves and find our own inspiration for where we can do the most good.
Thank you, Diana. That's a very likable thought, I think, to send along with us, that we need to start with ourselves and look in our networks. Oksana, do you have any final words? You're still muted.
This conversation also invited me to reconnect to my own place of peace and the place from which I have been involved in peace activism, and the feminist analysis that has helped me conceptualize it. And I think I heard a phrase not so long ago from a colleague who I was talking to and saying that I'm working with feminist organizations that work with peace. And she said, I don't have an impression that feminists are necessarily so much interested in peace, that, you know, we are seen as those struggling for something or fighting for justice or making conflict maybe in places where we would like to be, you know, maybe we would like to be seen as more peaceful. For me, I think the current time that I'm living in, but also all the thought and activism that has come before me from my sisters invites me to think about the difference between peace and pacification, and what that means to each one of us, and to bring in a genuine analysis of power and agency into whatever we are doing, both as those who maybe, as myself, I am right now in one hand on the receiving end of this war, but also as someone who is working to support organizations in communities. There's always this intersectionality of power where I am both privileged and oppressed. And I genuinely believe that feminist thought and practice can bring a transformation into the global infrastructure of peace and security when we start living and embodying this complexity of power that we carry. And I say this as also a theater practitioner, as somebody who works with embodied methods. I dream of seeing these shifts. And this means to me that we as feminists, yes, need to stay or work where we feel most connected, but also should not be afraid of going into places where power lies. and coming there with our hopefully liberated minds and transforming how that power is used or shared by just being there and by offering a different perspective. And hopefully this is something that I'm also trying to do wherever I am in these spaces. To me, this is simple, but also profoundly transformational.
Yeah. Thank you, Oksana. Thank you. Leila, do you have any final words you would like to send along with our audience?
Yes, thank you, Petra. I will not just repeat what has been said, but I would really like to remind us how fragile our pieces are and how fragile our justice are, and that there is no simple way or no guarantees that another conflict or another jeopardizing not only women's but like citizens' rights, but also human rights will be happening anywhere in the world, and especially in our backyard. So I would like to really stop here and just to thank you all for amazing contributions. And it was really a pleasure to see and to hear and to discuss certain issues that we are facing, and just to remind us it's not over. It's never over.
Thank you, Leila. Katerina.
I just want to thank everyone. I've learned a lot today, and it's been so interesting hearing everyone's thoughts. And just to echo what Oksana said as well about the power, I think everyone really emphasized in their interventions about the power that we have. And I think that that's kind of where we can start from, is where we can make the change in a very unequal and exclusionary world, but that we also still have this power for peace. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank everyone for listening into this panel on alternative narratives, feminist peace, and we very much appreciate that you took the time to be with us today. And this panel was the last panel of a 3-day-long digital conference that has taken place this week, where the first 2 days were for Kvinna to Kvinna's partners and women human rights defenders, while today's panels have been open also for external guests. So I would like to say a special thank you to you, our partners who have been with us this week, sharing and learning together. And we hope that we will be able to continue this conversation live in Skopje next year, if pandemic and budgets allow. And finally, I would also like to extend a big thank you to the interpreters and tech support who have made this conference possible. And I would like to end on a quote. A few weeks ago, a month and a half or something, Kvinna to Kvinna has been working for a long time with a network of women from Afghanistan. And when the war broke out in Ukraine, they wrote a letter as support. And I think that these few sentences symbolizes very well what we've been talking about, the strength of the solidarity and the power that comes from solidarity. And we need that power, that solidarity, to feel strong in order to enter the rooms that Oksana were talking about, to change the narrative. And what they wrote was, as Afghan women, we have faced the horrors of war that now confront our Ukrainian sisters. As women, they will pay the price of war, fear, violence, migration, poverty, and a crisis of identity. And they also will be expected to be pillars of support and a problem solver for their families as they weather this crisis. It is a heavy burden to bear. We aren't in better position than Ukrainian women, but we do offer our moral support to them. But more than that, we commit to amplifying their voices and stand ready to provide any advice and support that Ukrainian women leaders and women's organizations may need. Just as Afghan women must be part of any solution to its country's current crisis, so must Ukrainian women. And I think these words very clearly symbolizes the solidarity that we within Kvinna to Kvinna try to support and give the spaces so that we can share all of the excellent knowledge and expertise. So thank you everyone who contributed today. This conversation is not over, and I hope to see you soon, if not in a digital space, but then in a live space somewhere. So take care of each other and take care of your feminist friends, because we all need each other. Thank you. Bye.